to order as a subcommittee. Once we clearly have a quorum, we'll establish, once we have more members join us, we'll call the roll and establish a quorum. Let's go ahead and get started with the agenda. Again, our apologies for the schedule and the timing. We know that there are a number of committees going on, so members will be in and out. We've got seven measures that we're going to hear today. We will not be hearing AB 118. Correct, sir?
Yes, we should have 8 measures.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We'll have 8 members before us today. We will not be hearing AB 118, colleagues. So good afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started with AB 100. Ms. Costa.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Amy Costa with the Department of Finance. AB 100 is the trailer bill that authorizes a $6 billion supplemental pension payment in 2017-18 towards the state's pension costs to be funded by a loan from the Surplus Money Investment Fund. The repayment, it also provides for the repayment of the entire loan by June 30th, 2030 or sooner, repayment of interest and loan principal using Prop 2 funds for the general fund share, and special funds for the remainder of the loan beginning in 2018-19. Additionally, based on conversations that the administration had with Budget Committee staff, it includes a couple of various reporting requirements, including that the Department of Finance notify the Joint Legislative Budget Committee of several factors, including the schedule of pension payments to CalPERS, actuarial analysis with impacts of contributions, and a quarterly report of funds with insufficient balances to make loan repayments. I've testified previously that the administration estimates that this proposal would save $11 billion over 20 years. In the short term, we estimated general fund savings of over $600 million for fiscal years 2018-19, 19-20, and 2021. With that, we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Schaefer, are you just here for questions, or would you like to make some remarks?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be happy to offer a couple of remarks on the Treasurer's behalf.
Thank you.
The Treasurer fully supports this proposal because of the potential benefits it will have for Californians. The plan will reduce the state's pension contribution, as Ms. Costa has indicated, by reducing the amount of interest that the state will pay on its unfunded pension liability. That payment, of course, is part of the state's annual contribution. The money for the $6 billion will come from the Surplus Money Investment Fund, which is managed by the Treasurer's Office. The SMIF holds cash that is not immediately required to support state operations, and as a result, it is generally invested for very short time periods. Because it is invested for very short time periods, it typically bears a very low rate of interest. Presently, that rate of interest is less than 1%. The Treasurer believes that it is fiscally responsible to reallocate reasonable amounts of the SMIF to a debt that is effectively costing the state 7% interest. The upshot is that the state will receive better returns on its investment of idle funds and a reduction in the state's unfunded pension liability. As risk mitigants, the state will pay the SMIF back with interest based on the 2-year Treasury rate, which will be reset periodically to reflect the widely anticipated rise in rates that's presently underway. The Treasurer believes that by paying down the unfunded pension liability, the state is strategically and prudently reallocating its reserves to reduce the long-term cost of the unfunded liability. 2 last points. The Treasurer wishes to make clear that this is not a pension obligation bond. A pension obligation bond is external debt, money borrowed from a third party to be used for investment purposes. This is an internal borrowing. The state is borrowing from itself. And to be clear, these are surplus monies presently, not new sources of cash from outside the state. That would lead me to the final statement, which I feel compelled to offer because of some confusion that arises from time to time. This proposal does not impact local governments who are invested in the state treasurer's pool, the local agency investment fund. It affects only the state's short-term funds. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions at appropriate time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I know that the LAO is here. They're not at the table. They're here. If members have questions of the LAO, we can call them up. Before I open it up for questions, if I could just establish a quorum in case I lose some of you. So if you'd please call the roll.
Mitchell,
Here.
Nielsen, Anderson, Bell, Glazer, Jackson, McGuire, Mendoza, Monning, Morlock, Pan, Portantino, Roth, Skinner, Stone, Wykowski, Wilk.
Thank you very much. We have a quorum. I saw Senator Roth's hand. So Senator Roth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Within the last day or so, a commentator in this great state, whose intellect I respect, circulated an email suggesting that by borrowing this money from the surplus money investment funds and other funds, we are taking gas tax money or transportation money that could otherwise be used for road repair and construction and tossing it at pension liability. Could someone address that for me and clarify what may be unclear?
Eric Stern with the Department of Finance. I kind of need to step back a little bit to explain more of how the SMIF operates. So with all of the tax revenue, fee revenue, other receipts the state receives, generally all of that goes into the SMIF and is used for cash flow purposes, sort of like the state's checking account, basically. It's a clearinghouse to pay the state's bill. So the receipts go in, the expenses go out, and that's why it's a sort of a short-term pool. The way the pensions are funded across state government now is it's not that, CalPERS sends us basically a bill every year, and we don't just send a check back to CalPERS in sort of one, just out of one fund, is that we have to set up a contribution rate that is sort of akin to like a payroll tax that all that's levied on every single paycheck. So there's sort of an employer contribution that's made on 240,000 state employees' paychecks every single month that's collected, and then that's processed through the state controller's office. And those funds, though, that are paid out of all the payroll comes from more than 300 different fund sources. And those are the fund sources that are used to collect the revenues that are put into the SMIF. And so that commentary they're referring to is really sort of reflected a misunderstanding of how the fund sources work now. So currently, we are already charging more than 300 fund sources pension contributions. They make payroll contributions, they pay Social Security taxes, Medicare taxes, and pension contributions. All the sort of benefit and payroll expenses come out of those funds currently. And what we know is that those fund sources are already on the hook to pay increasing pension costs. We estimate they'll nearly double over the next 10 years. So those fund sources we know are going to be pressured over the next 10 years. And by using this mechanism of borrowing from the SMIF, borrowing from those same funds that are already going to have to pay higher contribution rates in the future, is that we're able to actually make lower contribution rates over the next 20 years, thereby saving those funds more money, so they'll be able to spend those dollars and other resources. But we're not skimming resources out of these funds that would otherwise be used for other purposes. But those funds are already there, paying those employee payroll and pension costs.
Senator Pan.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So first of all, just remind me again, how, this is the $6 billion. Over what period of time will it be paid back again?
So we set a statutory limit that it would be repaid by June 2030, but we're sort of estimating that we can get this repaid by within 10 years, 8 to 10 years.
Okay. And the other thing, And I know you referred to this fund, the surplus money investment fund, it's kind of like the state's checking account, right? And so I guess what I want to try to understand is that, so I recognize, you presented the benefits of this, and that what we're going to do is we're going to, I guess in some ways, I'll say flush with cash in terms of cash flow. So let's put $6 billion. And I know that you said normally this is in short term. So, but really what we're doing is taking $6 billion and putting it into a long term, right? Because you said like 10 years, 20, 30, maybe less than that. But so now we're going to take a chunk of this and put it into a long term thing, and it's going to be paid out. So we're going to so we're taking some risk in doing that with a return. So I guess my question is, so what work has been done? So, obviously there's nothing without risk, right? And in fact, if you want to return, you got to take some risk, but I think it's important to walk into risks eyes wide open, right? So one of the risks that I'm concerned about is, because this is our state's checking account, is that in a recession, we have a cash flow crunch, right? So what happens is, because you said money's coming in from various tax revenues, et cetera, comes into this fund, and then what happens if recession hits and suddenly we get less sales tax and we get less income tax and so forth, and we actually, so aside from the total amount, we now have a cash flow, big drop in cash flow. And now we've taken $6 billion and put it out there. And so in terms of the level of risk, at what point, and I realize it's a somewhat complex calculation, but if someone modeled, like how far does the economy have to go down? Like what kind of recession to the point where we would run into a place where we would have a cash flow crunch and we might have to borrow from outside to meet payroll and do those cash things. So aside from, deficits and so forth, just cash flow wise, what is the level of risk are we taking there? So how much of a decline in the economy could we absorb before we might run into a cash flow problem if we did this?
Senator Tim Schaefer from the State Treasurer's Office. I'll make an attempt to unbundle that question and answer it the best I can. I will tell you that presently the state's surplus money investment fund is awash with cash. That is as a result of actions taken by this administration and this legislature over the last number of years to realign receipts of revenues and expenditures of revenues. The result is that we have a good problem and a bad problem. The good problem is that we are awash in cash. The bad problem is that there are very, very few places to put it that earn anything other than anemic rates of interest. Presently, the state's pool money investment account is earning less than 1% interest. And so as a result, we have formed a judgment, which cannot be a promise, sir, but a judgment that given the size of the liquidity that we presently have in the state treasury, versus a relatively modest request of the size, and this is modest under the circumstances. I believe presently our office is sitting on, I didn't look this morning, $75 billion or so in liquidity. So this is a relatively modest request in that respect. And therefore, it is our judgment that knowing what we know today, this is a prudent and reasonable risk to take. Obviously, circumstances could change, but when those circumstances change, we also now have tools at our disposal that are quite different than what the state has had in the past when it's encountered cash flow difficulty. And I'll just give you one example of that. As we sit here today, about just a little under 1/2 of the state's surplus funds are invested in U.S. Treasury securities, the most liquid of all assets. So if there is a reversal, perhaps I should say when there is a reversal, the Treasurer believes that we are well positioned to meet that in terms of liquidity without becoming threatening to this particular proposal. I can't promise you what the future is, but I can promise you we'll be ready.
Well, it may follow up, sure. It's No, you're right. You can't predict the future, but you can anticipate, right? And I guess, and I appreciate your answer, but I guess what I want to know is that I hope someone's modeled some of this out and looked at, and not all models are perfect, but, and to look at, we just went through a really bad recession where you had things leveraged on things leveraged on things leveraged, and everything came down at the same time. I think that one of the things that, and it's great to know that we have, a lot of investments in U.S. Treasuries, which are very liquid. I guess what I want to try to understand is that, if we have a 2%, downturn in the economy, are we going to be worried about our cash flow, right? Maybe with $70 billion right now, we're like, no, we've our income tax drop because of that, et cetera. Stock market goes down, we're still okay. If we went down 10%, right, that's a pretty big risk. Then we might start. As I said, there's no reward without risk. So I'm not saying, well, I want a riskless proposition. I mean, that's unreasonable. But I think, as I said, we want to walk in eyes wide open. Right? I want to be able to tell the people of California, well, I voted for this because I know that Treasurer's Office Finance has modeled, and they said, barring a depression or a very severe recession, I have law state workers, I represent the Capitol, that we're going to meet payroll, right? And we're not going to have a problem with that, right? We're going to maintain a certain minimum amount of money in treasuries in addition to our short term that's going to be sure we're liquid. I don't want a thing on the front page of the Sacramento Bees saying that state now having to borrow money at high interest rates in order to meet payroll, right? So, so I know you can't promise any of that, but what I'm saying is that there must have been some modeling that's been done to say, well, this is how much tolerance we have. In other words, barring extraordinary events, so if we have a, we have a 2-3% recession, we're okay. That's the odds of having a problem, cash flow problem, et cetera, is extreme, is insignificant. If, obviously a depression or a major recession may be a little different, and we do have some tools to address that. But that's what I'm trying to get a sense of, because, I think I want to be able to say that this is what we're expecting, right? If something horrible happens, and who knows what happened in DC, et cetera, maybe we'll have a problem. But or things that we should normally expect, like having cyclic in the economy, should not lead to problems with our cash flow or other financial problems with our state's finances. Beyond so.
If I could add to this, Justin Howard from the Department of Finance. It's a very good question that you asked, Senator, and one thing that we did look at when developing this proposal in concert with the Treasurer's Office is we did go back over time, and we did look at the amount that was in the SMIF for the last 20 years, and look at the cyclical patterns month by month in order to get a sense of where we were, and we purposely went back to that period of time because we wanted to capture that period where we were in that great recession period where we had lows and there were worries about cash. And what I can tell you is that the SMIF at the time, at its very lowest point, in I believe it was 08 or 08-09, still had about $25 billion in the very lowest point. In the year preceding that, in 07-08, we were roughly around $39 billion, and the year following that, $42 billion. So if you look at the kind of the 3-year period during that very severe economic crunch that we were in, we still had some liquidity. Yes, it wasn't the best liquidity, and there was definitely concerns about cash at the time, but those are things that we did look at in deciding on what would we think is an appropriate amount that we could recommend to everyone that we could borrow from the SMIF given its current status, and knowing that should we turn this downturn, because as you know, one of the points we keep pointing out is there could be an economic downturn right around the corner. And so we definitely took that into consideration in looking at this proposal.
Well, that's certainly, did you have more to say? Yep.
Yeah, I think the other side to this equation, and they're talking about the liquidity side, is the overall architecture of the budget itself. And I've frequently testified before the committee about fiscal prudence. And as part of the Budget Act that was passed by this body earlier, our Prop 2 BSA account would be at $8 billion, or 67% of the constitutional target. Again, another tool that we have in our arsenal if we do experience a major economic event. And that proposition was passed basically coming out of some of those tough times as a way to put some of the more volatile revenue sources of cap gains aside for a rainy day or for when we're truly in trouble. So there's the liquidity, and then there's the overall architecture of the actual budget. And I would note that many of the expenditures in the Budget Act that you've debated and that have been before you are one-time in nature for that very reason, to guard us against some of these potential economic impacts.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I think that especially since what we're proposing is we're taking funds out of what I've just been testified to as the state's checkbook and has been invested in short term, we are now deciding to take a chunk of that, if you have 70 billion, 6 billion, and put it into essentially a long-term obligation, all right? So it's not, I agree, it's not a pension bond, et cetera, but it is a long-term obligation. So we're tying up the cash, right? It's not, we can't just liquidate that, right? And so, and I don't know in terms of again, when you talk about over a structure, I realize that's the other angle on that. I am focusing on liquidity, partially because we were taking short-term money that we've to date said should only be invested in short-term. That's why we're getting such a low rate of return. Anyone who's got a money market account knows what it's like. And saying that, well, let's take some of that and put it in something less liquid. All right, we're going to, and there's going to be some benefits to that, but I just want to know the level of risk we're taking with our liquidity, which is separate from the Prop 2 part, because I assume we're taking some of that money, maybe is it sitting in short term, or maybe it's in some longer term investments that we can get a better return. But I just want to be sure that we're not going to run into some kind of unanticipated problem that we should be, being sure we look out into what could happen in the future. And like the governor says, things you have downturns, et cetera, that we're in a position that we're not going to put ourselves at, be blindsided or having, we said we need to know what the risks are in order to accept the risk in return for the return, not just simply say, well, we got a great, benefit, but the risk, it's something, but I'm not sure what it is. So I want that. I appreciate getting the risk clarified.
Senator, one last thing to offer you a bit of reassurance on that. The nature of the short-term financial markets that the state treasury invests in nowadays have changed in their characteristics profoundly since 2008. Now, I'm doing this from memory, so those of you who are making notes, please put a plus or minus next to this, but the state presently is invested just about 45 or 48% in U.S. Treasury securities. The result is that when there is a reversal of fortune, the bid side, the price at which those securities can be liquidated, doesn't fall away nearly as quickly as it does on different types of securities. And there is always a liquid market for U.S. Treasury securities. Secondly, and we have discussed this at the operating level with the Department of Finance, we are very mindful of the idea that we need, during the pendency of this proposal, to be very circumspect in expanding other programs and investment strategies that might impair our liquidity. That is implicit in all this, and I will make it explicit to you today. We are very mindful of that. So our view is that because this represents a curtailment of liquidity, it will require a corresponding change on our part in investment patterns to make sure that we remain nimble when, not if, the next downturn comes. And that's the best we can do without a crystal ball.
Thank you, Dr. Pan. I've got 6 members who have questions. I just want to ask now 7. If anybody has a question that follows on Dr. Pan before we kind of shift topics. Senator Roth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll make this quick because I've already spoken, but I want to try to get some clarity to what Dr. Pan was asking. And he asked about predictive modeling. And I know in the CalPERS business, they do that when they're setting their investment rates and things like that. Has anyone done predictive modeling? We predict how the how the budget's going to be impacted by the economy and things like that. We hear that all the time when we have our big budget hearing at the outset of the budget process. So has anyone done predictive modeling, good, okay, bad, in terms of predicted conditions in the future and the impact on the state and our surplus money investment funds, pooled money accounts as a result? And has the modeling been reduced to a report that we can read?
The short answer is no. We haven't done anything to that extent other than reviewing that, as Justin said, the sort of the past history with the SMIF and the liquidity, working with the Treasurer's Office to understand what sort of cushion would still need to be there to keep our cash flow needs going. And it's really important to emphasize, and I really can't say anything more than Mr. Schaefer said, but we couldn't do this without the Treasurer's Office signing off and saying that this is a sound policy moving forward, that we're not going to put the state in any sort of cash crunch or cash bind from this process.
Well, not being a finance person and certainly not being an accountant, is the question an intelligent one? I mean, should we do modeling so that we know, at least try to predict what the future is going to bring with respect to this $6 billion investment, or is that just folly?
I think we know what the general risks are. It's in terms of interest rate risk, investment risk, liquidity risk. There's been sort of full transparency and exposure of what those variables are, and we just don't believe that if we just keep studying and developing 1,000 scenarios of different factors and variables that could play out in any given year, we would still get to the same result that we're looking at now, which is this is probably a good idea. This is probably going to work out. It would be barring sort of a major event where interest rates go through the roof and PERS has long-term prolonged investment slump, which we've only seen bad returns really happen for 2 or 3 years in a row before they rebound again. So barring those events that really are very unlikely to happen, is that this will pay off, is that the interest rate, the returns from PERS are generally going to be higher over time, over 20 years, than the interest rate we'll have to pay back on the SMIF loan. So you're going to have that gap, that arbitrage, that there's just a very high probability of success with this.
If we'd started this in 2005, for example, and had made the $6 billion deposit in 2005, moving forward, given what happened after that, what would the result be? Still positive? Is that a fair question?
It is a fair question.
Because that's a fact, right?
Because that's the investment risk is the big wild card. And what we know, though, is that the $6 billion, if it lost a quarter of the value, so in 0809, the CalPERS fund lost about a quarter of the value. So if $6 billion went down, to $4 billion, what that means is that just that savings gets reduced by a little bit. I mean, so CalPERS is modeling out for us that if they hit their investment target over the next 20 years, we'd have $12 billion in contribution rate savings. We cut off the $1 billion for the interest rate payments, but that $12 billion, if we're 50% off on that, that's $6 billion of savings. That still seems like a pretty good deal. If we're way off and we're maybe $4 billion, it's still a good deal. If interest rates double, we're projecting, working with the Treasurer's Office, that knowing that interest rates will probably increase on the 2-year Treasury bill, going up to probably in the 3% range over the next 3 to 4 or 5 years, that we estimate $1 billion in interest payments. If we double that, let's just say we're 100% off $2 billion in interest payments. So that means that cuts into that sort of arbitrage, but that gap is still going to be there. That's why it's really hard to imagine a scenario where we're going to be so off base over a 20-year period that this isn't going to pencil out. It's just so hard to imagine that scenario happening. Now, there's going to be downturns. Over the next 20 years, will CalPERS not hit 7%? Absolutely. Will they hit 0% or a negative return in a given year? Most likely. That's bound to happen again. But over a 20-year period, their returns always sort of return to the median, which is a 7% return over a 20-year period. So we're feeling very confident that this will pencil out the right way.
Madam Chair, may I offer something to Senator Roth? If we take today and we look backward in increments, Senator, 3 years backwards from today, 5 years backwards, 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years, the range of difference between the 2-year Treasury constant maturity rate, it's a term of art that says what do 2-year Treasuries earn. The difference between that and the CalPERS rates over those periods of time, so last 3, last 5, last 10, last 20, last 30, has ranged from 4.5% over the last 30. So in other words, a 2-year borrowing would cost you 4.5% less than the 30-year average of PERS rates. It has actually widened over the last 2 measurement periods, 3 years and 5 years. For example, PERS annualized returns over the last 3 years are 5.2%, but 2-year Treasury constant maturities is less than 1% over that period of time. Looking backwards 5 years, the differential is 7.5%. That's one of the things that makes us more comfortable, not sanguine, you understand, because this is the investment market, but more comfortable is that right now, especially because interest rates are low and are expected to stay low for a period of time, that this represents a reasonable thing for the state to do. There's no such thing as a sure thing, but reasonable.
Got it. And Madam Chair, I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. Senator Morlock, who will be followed by Senator Monning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have been publicly supportive of this idea and did some similar techniques when I was treasurer for the County of Orange, utilizing funds to prepay the retirement system in Orange County. So as a treasurer, you do have surplus funds that, you'll never touch. So they're just kind of sitting there all the time, but you never, historically, never dip down to them. So I'm comfortable with the use of using the surplus funds. In working on this deal, it's missing the sizzle that we obtained in Orange County. We would say to the retirement system board of directors, we want to prepay. What will you do to make it more interesting? And the first year we did this, when I was treasurer back in '06, is they said, we'll give you the full discount rate. And so I could borrow money at a rate lower than the 7.75, prepay everything up front, and I paid that note, a 1-year note, off in 26 equal payments. And so we made the arbitrage, as Mr. Stern had mentioned, and we saved the county about $4 million. And it was on a small amount, about $125 million, but in future years, we were paying $400 million, and we were saving $20 million a year for the taxpayers, rather significant. And at the end of the day, we said, okay, did the system suffer from our prepaying and changing our approach, and did it lose on investments, et cetera, et cetera? How did it all pan out? At the end of the day, the system was ahead. So it worked out. So from experience, I'm comfortable, and that's why I was even willing to do a joint editorial with Mr. Schaefer's boss, John Chung. So I'm honored to have Tim Schaefer here. Tim is an Orange County boy, and we've worked together over the years. He is an investment guru who I highly regard and respect. So I want to ask him, because I'm trying to work with CalPERS, and I'm trying to get some sizzle, and I'm not getting anywhere. And so how is your boss doing on this front?
And perhaps Mr. Schaefer can define sizzle or give us a parameter about, In the financial. Right. I mean, how, right.
Just let him talk and be amazed.
Technical term, Madam.
Clearly.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind acknowledgement, Senator. So as to the question, where is my boss on this? My boss has not yet, and I don't mean to frustrate you by equivocating, my boss has not yet dropped anchor on this. As you know, the treasurer constitutionally has a seat on the PERS board. At the staff level, I hear you. I recognize the simplicity of the message, and as an investment professional, I have a strong affinity to that message. However, the treasurer is not yet there. What we have hopefully communicated, Senator, to your staff is that we're certainly willing to be part of the dialogue with the legislature and the administration and others, if there is such a dialogue to be had, to present whatever actionable facts we can that would inform the dialogue. Otherwise, to get out of everybody's way and let happen what needs to happen. But I can't promise you more than that. I'm very conscious of your actions when you were the county treasurer tax collector in Orange. I was a constituent. I was a financial consultant in your county at the time you did that. I understand the concept. And as a financial professional, I think that the concept has merit. But I'm not speaking for my boss. I'm speaking for Tim Schaefer on that because my boss has not yet dropped anchor.
So then, Mr. Schaefer, that's an argument for a little more dialogue, so I appreciate your response. The response I got from Cal PERS was, well, the actuaries don't want to do that. So I'm just curious, do you know how many actuaries Cal PERS has on staff?
Oh, golly, I wish I could quote that, but I can't. I suspect somebody from the Department of Finance can, but I cannot.
I think it's roughly 20, give or take.
And are all of their actuaries internal, or do they have any external actuaries?
It's mostly internal for the state plans.
Okay, so some internal dialogue needs to happen. Mr. Schaefer, the treasurer is not going to drop this $6 billion all at once into Cal PERS, is that correct?
Well, that's not the treasurer's call. It's at the call of the administration and the Department of Finance. The discussions that we've had to date have always been centered around the idea that, like dollar cost averaging, you would not make a lump sum deposit, but rather you would distribute the deposits throughout the course of the accounting period. And I believe, I'll let the Department of Finance speak for itself, but what we have looked at internally is that it would be either 3 or 4 installments in the 17-18 fiscal year.
Yeah, Senator Morlock, that is correct. We are not planning on doing all at once. As Mr. Schaefer has indicated, we do plan on doing it over a course of time. What we're looking at is basically doubling down on our regular payments that we make on a quarterly basis.
Right there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hardman?
Howard?
Howard, thank you. It's Justin, right?
That's correct.
Okay, I got part of it right. That was the next question, is the market timing, just kind of worried about the dollar cost averaging. So we have a governor who's predicting a downturn, even making concerns about cuts, and we had Cal PERS that was expecting maybe a downturn in repositioned equities last fall, like in September, and has already lost, over $1 billion in opportunity costs by missing the Trump bump. That's some 16% equity rise. So it's almost like we're a year late. It's too bad we didn't put all that money in a year ago. But we've also tried to work with Cal PERS, Mr. Schaefer, to say, hey, maybe we could put the money in an investment that is like a 7% interest paying corporate bond or something where it's good quality debt, but we could avoid the equity swings. But I'm getting pushback on that as well. Do you have any suggestions?
Senator, despite my my prowess in the investment field, I will be the first one to admit to you and to the members of the committee that I'm a fixed income guy. I do not try to predict changes in the equity market because I'm no good at it. That's why I stick to fixed income. So no, I've not I've not had such a discussion with them.
So we put 6 billion in, and we saved 600 million in the first year, which has already been stated. But if the market adjusts or corrects 10%, then we've lost our 600 million in savings. So I think the biggest fear that we all have is that we don't want to be Governor Christine Todd Whitman, where we put it in just before a major downturn. So I appreciate that investment risk concern. I can still remember as treasurer that come to me and say, "God, your yield is so low, and if we could, go out longer, then we could make more." And so I'd say, "Fine, I'll do a laddered portfolio for you," and then they'd never come back. They just didn't want to take those risk decisions. So right now we have 427 million, Amy, coming out of Proposition 2, and I believe the Senate recommendation was just to use that money to pay every year into CalPERS as opposed to taking the loan and paying down the loan with the 427. Wouldn't that be a better way of dollar cost averaging?
So the advantage we get from sort of priming the pump, putting $6 billion into the system sort of upfront over the next year is that we're able to snap the contribution rate curve that we know is, like I said before, is expected to nearly double over the next 10 years. If we are only dedicating a smaller portion, maybe a couple $100 million a year, on top of our current $6 billion payment, you don't get really a material difference in what happens to our contribution rate. So it'll help over 10 years. Putting in $200 million a year helps, but it won't bend that cost curve down. And what we're looking for is to be able to achieve some more immediate savings in the short term and throughout that 20-year forecast period for modeling out the contribution rates.
And then could someone clarify that the 427 million was a one-time?
Well, let me speak to that. That's what I was going to hopefully correct here. The 426 was on the basis of the administration's May revision, which at the time did not include all the adjustments to the Prop 2 debt payments that included the weight fee change that is now part of that. As a result, the amount that's available from the Prop 2 debt payments for the upcoming fiscal year is only $146 million. So that'll be the amount that is available initially to contribute towards the repayment of this loan in the first year. So not the 426. The language that was adopted in the budget was flexible insofar as it mentioned that we could go up to that amount, but it didn't specify the amount at which we would do, knowing that there could be some changes within the Prop 2 payment mix.
Madam Chair, I kind of ask for a clarification on that because I didn't understand what you just said. I know you said that in the May revise you had an amount up to, but why can't we contribute up to that amount? Is there a limitation?
Yeah, so the way that the Prop 2 works, it's a formulaic calculation that determines the amount of funds that are available to pay down long-term liabilities and debts of the state. As part of the budget agreement, those funds have been what's the word I'm looking for? Not prescribed, but they've been scheduled out for various payments. And as part of the budget deal, there was an agreement to move the weight fee loan repayment into the Prop 2 debt repayment schedule. And as such, that reduced the amount of funding that was otherwise available for the initial repayment of this proposed loan.
To follow up on that?
Yes.
Is that in a trailer bill that we have adopted and the governor has signed, or where is that, the weight fee change?
It's in the budget bill itself. The governor has not signed it yet.
I see, thank you.
Okay, then that kind of knocks out some of my other quick questions. So we're dealing with a variable rate, and I'm concerned about it being open-ended to 2030, slowly paying it now, obviously much slower pay now. Instead of 427 a year, we're looking at 163 a year, so that's disconcerting. So I'm wondering if you made it a one-year note, but you made it renewable every year.
Senator, the proposal that's in front of us is that the note has, I shouldn't call it a note, the arrangement has a terminal date on it that has a mechanism built into it, as we understand it, that would enable more rapid repayment. The interest rate that we have proposed to the administration is pegged to the 2-year Treasury rate, which would be reset quarterly. So in a rising interest rate environment, the cost of this arrangement will begin to rise in sympathy with rising rates. I would be quick to point out that because it is pegged to a 2-year Treasury, as you know from your days as a treasurer, shorter-term maturities tend to have lower interest rates than longer-term maturities for a variety of economic theoretical reasons. But it's for that reason that we chose that, because if you look at the repayment terms that have been modeled, not that will necessarily happen, but which have been modeled, this is not a 12-year loan where you borrow money today and you repay it in the 12th year, but rather as it amortizes, the average life of it becomes shorter and shorter. And if, in fact, the repayments are accelerated, the average life becomes shorter still, and that's why we chose the 2-year. For no other reason than it was readily available, it was not subject to manipulation, and that it could be visible and transparent to everybody who was involved in the transaction.
So to go back to Senator Pan's concern about the cash flow, I don't see in the bill where we could convert that $6 billion payment that was made this year into a payment against a future year. So that way, let's say next year we have a cash flow problem, and we just say, hey, we don't have to pay the $6 billion this year. We just use what we paid last year that we prepaid, and therefore you've got your money back, and we're out of the cash flow crunch immediately. And I don't see that kind of exit strategy in the bill.
You know, I think I would be remiss if I haven't pointed out the fact that, you know, the state does have tools to help us during cash liquidity or cash flow crisis. We can issue RANs, which are revenue anticipation notes, should we need to. And those are always available for us to be able to address those situations. So those would be something that we could exercise should we need to as a state.
Okay, then last two questions. CalPERS has looked at what's called an IRC, Internal Revenue Code, Section 115 trust. Is this what we're using, or is this, or is it just going straight into the plan with no 115 trust?
Well, the pension fund is structured as that a retirement fund under the IRS code. I think what you might be talking about is that you might be referring to is that about a year ago, the CalPERS board was discussing sponsoring legislation to create a second pension fund, another trust fund that would be used to help employers make supplemental payments that would potentially get a lower yield.
And that has nothing to do with this?
It has nothing to do with this.
Thank you. Then, Madam Chair, if I had a recommendation, and maybe I should even ask the LAO to come up, but I'm concerned about maybe getting some things still squared down and pinned down before we approve AB 100. And I know the LAO's already kind of opined that they would like some more time, and I'm kind of wondering if I would too.
So Senator Moorlach, we've got several other members who have questions. If you wouldn't mind, can we go through and get some of the other members' questions, and then perhaps we'll invite the LAO to come up and comment on questions posed by others. Is that okay with you? Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate you. Senator Monning, who'll be followed by Senator Nielsen.
I'll withdraw. My questions have been answered.
Thank you. Senator Nielsen.
I kind of refer to Proposition 2, which was a very significant initiative. The idea had been around a long time and never got purchased, and then it did. And it became something very significant to, if you will, put a governor on state spending that off the top every year achieves that purpose. But it was also intended to allow necessarily general fund monies to be used, half of the general fund monies to be used to pay off certain debts, which is what you're attempting to do here, I believe. But it also was intended to, or crafted to heed and to limit long-term spending, base building, longer-term obligations. Don't we, to a degree, increase our long-term obligations through what we're trying to accomplish here, notwithstanding what we're doing about debt reduction? But there is a long-term obligation. And we've talked about the vicissitudes of the markets and what can happen there. There's risk. But isn't that a concern? In other words, increasing our long-term obligations. The goal is to, in some way, reduce the long-term debt. But if you're having a long-term obligation to retire that debt, isn't that a bit of a risk?
So the retirement liabilities are already sort of being scored and tracked as those long-term obligations. The $6 billion, which would be treated as a loan, would constitute another debt that we do have to pay back. Oh. And like I said earlier, is that we are projecting it to be paid back within 10 years, though.
And it does note that this can be paid back from, I think it says, other funds. And those other funds would be assessed, I don't know if the word was fair share or a certain portion. How is that fair share determined from, say you were borrowing from several funds?
So there would be approximately 300 funds that would be making these contributions back to repay the loan. But these are the funds that are already making pension contributions today. That's what I was talking about earlier. Is that there's a structure that's set up for payroll contribution rates that tap into every one of these 300 plus fund sources, and the repayment of the loan would be made through those exact same fund sources, and those contribution rates, theoretically, based on our projection, would be lower than what they would otherwise have been if we had not pursued this approach.
The last thing I find myself intrigued by Senator Morlock's thought of annual renewal, and I'd like the continuing dialogue on this to be respectful of considering that annual renewal. I think that gives the state another control mechanism. That's all I have.
Thank you, sir. Senator Glazer.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I also have some questions for the analysts. The analysts raised some serious issues with this proposal, and I'm looking forward to hearing their testimony and thoughts. But before that, I wanted to make a couple observations. First, I think that Governor Brown deserves a lot of credit for not just his proposal today, in trying to deal with this problem of our underfunding, but the work that he's done since he was elected governor. In 2011, he came out with his 12-point pension plan that he put forward to the legislature. Many of those issues were adopted in 2012, raised the retirement age, reduced the amount of compensation that one was going to get. He dealt with the issue of spiking, by requiring that compensation be based on 3 years of your final 3 years, not just the last year. He dealt with the normal cost issue in terms of splitting that. And not only was it adopted as a proposal, but in all the collective bargaining contracts that we have heard, many of which I have not been very happy with, but to his credit, that sharing, that normal sharing was a part of, I think, every one of those contracts. And so I know that his heart is in the right place in terms of identifying this as a serious problem that requires constant attention. And of course, we've seen over the years his work through his appointees at CalPERS to try to get them to accept a more responsible return rate on investments. And that rate has been driven down from 7.5%, I think, at the start of his administration, heading down to 7%, which I think is being phased in. Although it's important to note that I believe that the experts at CalPERS acknowledge that maybe a more prudent rate would be closer to the 6.2% rate. And I know that this is an endeavor that the governor continues to work on through his appointees, since he doesn't vote per se on CalPERS, that is not a realistic rate of return. He knows it, and somehow we have to get CalPERS to recognize it. But what does all that mean at this moment in time? CalPERS is 64% funded? That's why we're here, right? Because we are facing an unsustainable pension program for our employees, right? It still doesn't pencil out. Despite all of those efforts, we don't have something that we believe is sustainable. And I think that the warning sign for me on these types of issues has always been that the decisions that are made today, the consequences are really not going to be felt for a long, long time to come. That most of us will be gone by the time this decision works or doesn't work in terms of how we got ahead of this problem at CalPERS and certainly arguably at CalSTRS as well. Have we got ahead of it? And so these choices by very smart people, very committed to seeing this problem and trying to do something about it is nevertheless a worrisome enterprise, particularly one where we haven't had a lot of time to do the worst case scenarios as those questions have arisen in this hearing, that you have to look not at our best of intentions, but you have to look at the worst case that none of us would like to even imagine. And here we're trying to imagine this in a fund that's only 64% funded after an incredible economic expansion that borders on 6-7 years. And yet we're facing a budget that we have just approved where the administration's been clear about what the future looks like from their perspective, which is not rising black surpluses, but red ink of deficits ahead. And so that's the context in which I look at this proposal from the best of intentions, but coming in late, giving us very little time to examine it, to look at all those worst case scenarios, and knowing that the choices we make here really have incredible long-term consequences. So I am hopeful, Madam Chair, that we can hear from the analysts to go through some of the concerns that they have raised. I do have some additional points that I want to flag. The pooled money investment fund.
Senator Glazer, you want to flag this for the analysts or for the folks at the table now?
No, I'd love to hear from the analysts if you're prepared for that. I'd love to.
I'm not. If you don't mind, let's get through the first round. I'll invite the analysts up, and I'll add you to the questions for the analysts. If all the rest of your questions are for the analysts, would you mind waiting?
I have a couple others that don't relate to the analysts.
Perfect. Let's go to those.
Our witnesses to speak of.
Thanks.
The pooled money investment fund, if we felt that fund was operating in an inappropriate way, there certainly have been a lot of opportunities over the last 10, 20, 30 years to say their investments are too conservative. But nothing that I have heard within the legislative context or from the administration has indicated that we're being too conservative until this exact point in time now. And I'd like to hear whether you think that, absent this proposal, do you think that we've have created standards of investment returns for that fund that have not been appropriate for what that fund is expected to be used for?
Excellent question. The short answer, Senator, is no. I don't think you've created inappropriate standards at all. I do think that the market environment that the Treasury is operating in today, in 2017, is unlike any I've seen in close to 50 years in the investment business. Regardless of what we believe the rate of inflation is, it's probably not zero. But let's just assume for the moment that it's plus or minus 2%. One would have to invest in U.S. Treasury securities with a nominal term of almost 20 years just to earn the inflation rate back. The market opportunities for short-term investments in particular are particularly vexing to us because one can invest in Treasury bills, federal agency securities, and earn the lofty sums of well less than 1% interest. That doesn't even keep up with inflation if inflation is half of a 2% assumption. And that is particularly challenging for us. I don't remember a time in my career in the fixed income markets when we've seen such a prolonged period of time where the investment markets looked like this. That's the first of two parts in my response to you. The second part would be that since the financial crisis in 2008, the cafeteria of investment choices available to the treasurer has been very significantly limited. And that's a function of changes in federal regulation, risk aversion on the parts of banks. So we have a smaller universe of securities that we can invest in as a result of that. That smaller universe of investments makes our already conservative stance even more challenging to keep up with the market in, because the way one balances risk and reward is to paddle a little left and paddle a little right, be conservative with the majority of it, but when you see the opportunity, take a wee bit more risk, and it just simply isn't there for us in the short-term markets.
Sir, but my question is, absent this proposal that's on the table today, would you recommend a change in that very conservative investment practice, which you just described correctly, to us as policymakers? Do you think we should give you more flexibility to try to earn a greater rate of return than what you're limited to investing in today?
That is not our request, Senator, and I wouldn't recommend such a request.
Okay. So what that says to me is that know that you see this money and the requirements for it to be in the most conservative place possible, yet you're recommending that we use it, that we use $6 billion of it to leverage because of this pension problem that we see. That's what's creating some level of confusion for me.
Senator, the best way I could respond to you is, and I mean no disrespect in putting it this way, I'm a simple person, so I'm going to express myself simply. The pension obligation that the state owes exists, and it is earning interest, an implicit rate of interest at the presumed rate of earnings of the retirement fund. And that is just north of 7%. And our view is that when we look around in the Treasury and say, is this a risk arbitrage? Are we investing in something that is at the frontier of our risk tolerance? The answer is no, we already owe this debt. It exists. So then it becomes a choice of substitution. Would you, and the example I use, and I mean no disrespect to the committee, is that the example I use, and I use this to the treasurer at our very first conversation. If you were an investor and you came to me, your financial advisor, in my past life and said, I have ample money set aside to cover emergencies in my savings account and my checking account, and now I've just come into an inheritance of $10,000, and I want to put it in the stock market. My question to you would be, do you have a credit card and is there a balance on it? And if the answer to that is yes, then I think we'd better think long and hard in my simplistic example about paying off or paying down that credit card balance, because it is likely going to be much higher than what we could earn in the short term if we put it into the equity market.
Got it. Madam Chairman, one more question for finance, if I may.
Sure.
If we put $6 billion into CalPERS, does that reduce the normal costs for the employer and the employee? In other words, by putting that money in there, I know it's part of the 3 parts of investment returns that we need to get. Does that lower the normal costs for an employee?
No, it just is applied to the state's unfunded liability.
So there is no effect on an employee by prepaying the $6 billion in terms of their obligations to paying 50% of the normal costs?
Right, not in terms of their contribution rates that they pay.
Other than, if I may add to that, it slows the growth of the contribution rate, which at some point, if the normal costs ever became out of balance, that would then result in us needing to go back to the table to make sure that we would negotiate and maintain that 50-50 cost sharing. So by maintaining the lower contribution rates through this supplemental payment, it does impact employees.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Senator McGuire? And Mr. Glazer, I'll come back to you when we bring Ellie up to the table. Senator McGuire.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and do appreciate the in-depth discussion and appreciate all the hard work in regards to the recommendation as well. Just a few questions. 7%. And I also know that besides the treasurer sitting directly on the PERS board, making those decisions going from 7.5 to 7, none of you are able to make that decision but want to get your gut. Since we're basing this off of that 7% return at the PERS board, brought down, by the way, finally, you feel like that's safe in the term of what this loan would be?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yes.
Okay. Good times. What I'd like to be able to know is talk about doing nothing and play that scenario out where our annual contributions will grow over the next 15 years between now and 2030.
It'd be a 93% increase in 2031-32 in state cost. It would grow to $11.2 billion.
Would you consider the $11 billion savings that's been projected as a safe and conservative estimate or a stretch goal?
I'd say it's a reasonable estimate based on the assumptions that CalPERS uses to project contribution rates and investment returns over a long period of time.
And when you say reasonable, you believe it is a practical approach. You believe it's a practical number. It's just want to be able to get a better definition of what reasonable means.
Correct. Over the long term, it's a practical, achievable number to hit 7% returns over a 20-year period.
Okay. When was the last time the SMIF was this high as far as the fund balance? And has it been?
Justin Howard, Finance. Looking at my numbers here, it looks like back in December 31st of 2010, the SMIF had about $51 billion in it. So that was probably the last point in time where it was close to where it is today.
And to confirm, we're over 70 now.
We're over 70 overall in the pooled money investment account. The SMIF is the state side. The pooled money investment account is a combined fund of the SMIF and the local area investment fund. So when you combine the local and the state number, it's over 70 billion.
So we're at and or near or a bit exceeded where our historical high was. And the reason why I bring that up is, that's correct, going to where Mr. Roth and Mr. Pan were discussing in regards to if we saw the economy hit the fan and we go into the worst recession like we just came out of 8 years ago, our lowest point was at 25 billion within the SMIF. Just to confirm that again. Okay, and that was without our rainy day fund that's projected to be 12 billion by 2020, 2021, somewhere right in there, and currently at about 8.5.
Just to be clear,
Yeah.
remember that the SMIF is constituted of more than 1,000 funds, not all of which are borrowable. So even when the state experiences liquidity challenges, there are still funds in the Treasury. They may not be borrowable, but they still exist. And that's an important nuance that I would focus you on.
And I do share the concerns we've heard from many of the panel members here today in regards to how long it has been for this state to finally start tackling our liability, whether it's the issue of healthcare benefits and each staff member, employee of the state's given 2% pre-tax back in regards to those concessions. We're starting to take a look at significant movement on the state teacher retirement side, which is now over $70 billion. And I think we have about 28 or 27 good years left in our state teacher retirement system. I know that's going to be a significant issue. A separate account, completely get it, but going to where Mr. Glazier was discussing, I think that there has been some movement, but I think the challenge that we have is this has been ignored candidly for so long. We are now saddling future generations with tremendous debt and trying to be able to develop innovative solutions to be able to buy this down with as little risk as possible for those taxpayers. And I do appreciate all the work that has gone in it. And finally, Madam Chair, appreciate all the work also of Mr. Morlock as well, particularly coming from his background, being able to do the deep dive and looking into this. So thank you so much, Mr. Block. Morlock. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Stone?
Madam Chair, I think most of the questions have been asked that I was going to ask, so
Okay.
I'm going to refrain for right now.
All right, thank you. If I could ask the LAO to come to the table, I'm committed to circle back to Senators Morlock and Glazer.
Madam Chair, may I ask one question of finance?
Sure, go ahead, as they're coming.
So I know Senator Roth initiated quite, but I just want to, so is there going to be a report or of the, so I heard improbable, et cetera, but we're a finance committee, so it's numbers, right? And, you can do Monte Carlo simulations, other types of things. Is there a report that's going to come from, I guess, finance or treasurer's office, someone that lays out what our risks are? I'm not looking for infinite scenarios, but I think, you can look at various inflation rates, you can look at different, interest rates, et cetera, that say, okay, and then looking at, projected cash flow issues, where are essentially the boundaries of where we start getting in trouble? And maybe since LAO's up here, they can touch on that, but I'd like to actually have a report like that. Do you anticipate doing such a report? And hopefully the answer is yes, and then we ask, when would we expect to see it?
The trailer bill calls for the Department of Finance to issue a report by September 1st of this year that looks at the economic risks and benefits of this concept, as well as some actuarial modeling of how this shapes out.
So September 1st, right. And I guess the follow-up question to that is that, before we dive into this, we'd like to see the report. And so, I think it's fine to say, well, you know what, we'll go along, we'll wait for the report. But before we pull the trigger on this, I think, don't we need to see that information?
I think that the information that the report is going to contain is really been thoroughly discussed in terms of identifying those risks already, and we can try to package that together. A lot of it has been verbal in these committee hearings over the last few weeks since the May revision, since the proposal came out. But I was communicating to Senator Roth earlier, is that at the end of the day, is that we have been fully transparent with what the risks are. We know what the liquidity risks are. We know what the interest rate risks are. We know what the investment rate risks are. And the ultimate outcome of, is this going to work out, is going to be, we're going to come to the same conclusion.
Okay, you said we're sitting here. I'm not going to ask for a vote of how many people, because we're waiting for this report in September. At least this part of we on here, and maybe I may be wrong, haven't seen the report. So it's, I know we've had discussion. I appreciate the answers I've gotten, but I do feel that we need a chance to read the report, digest the report, because after all, we up here are a part of the decision-making process, and you're asking us to make a decision, and we need to have information, and you're telling me we'll have a report in September.
Madam Chair, I do want to just note, taking a step back from this particular proposal and the overall architecture of the budget, which is, and to clarify Senator Morlock's point, so we score savings in the immediate term of $600 million, not necessarily in the first fiscal year. So our estimates are that in 2018-19, this proposal generates about $93.9 million in general fund savings. In 1920, $299.9 million, and then in 2021, $230 million, and then it kind of averages around $200 million throughout the 20-year period. I would note, as part of the overall Budget Act architecture, though, obviously, we have assumed these savings, and so those are being counterbalanced by the expenditures put forward in the budget plan. So to the issue of timing, I just want to make sure it's clear to the committee that these savings have been assumed as part of the Budget Act that you voted on previously.
LAO, why don't we have you initiate some comments based on what you've heard today, and then we'll ask Senator Morlock and Glazer to raise their specific questions.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. My name is Nick Schroeder with the Legislative Analyst's Office. We think that the proposal probably would result in net savings to the state, But our primary criticism of the proposal consistently has been that as a May revision proposal, the legislature really doesn't have a lot of time to consider the complexities of this. And also considering the magnitude and complexity of the proposal, the administration really did not provide sufficient legal or quantitative analysis for the proposal, when it submitted the proposal to the legislature. And so I think that this discussion that you've had today has really highlighted a lot of those criticisms, that this is a serious issue, and there really is not sufficient analysis out there to understand the range of possible effects, both on the investment side, on the cash side, as Dr. Pan mentioned. And while the administration might be aware of what the risks are, they have not conducted the analysis to understand what the effects of those risks are.
Senator Morlaw, your questions of LAO?
We have not seen the quantitative, because it's nice to hear the term Monte Carlo used here, but what happens over time? How's it pencil out? No one's given me it, at least I haven't seen it, and I've got plenty of paperwork, but how did we quantify the $11 billion savings? And so I would assume that's using the current assumptions, and if everything were just static, but we don't have anything that shows how it would perform based on whether we start in 2005 or any other scenarios. So is it maybe, have you looked at the Department of Finance's calculation of the $11 billion savings?
Yes, and the calculation is, as you suggest, it's based on one scenario, which is the pension board's assumed rate of return is 7%.
So we don't have any standard deviations?
No, there's no stochastic modeling showing multiple scenarios of possible investment returns. No.
And I guess my last question is, I was sort of caught by surprise today that I was thinking we had $427 million a year, but now we have $163 million a year. So have we done an amortization schedule to see how that plays out?
No, we have not. We have not anyway.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Finance. Mm-hmm.
Justin Howard again from the Department of Finance. I do want to point out that what we provided to the LAO and what we ultimately landed on our proposal, we provided those calculations, but those weren't the only scenarios that the Department of Finance reviewed in landing on this proposal. We looked at a whole host of potential scenarios, including whether or not that you're going to get a different investment rate, whether or not there are investment gains and losses from previous years that we should buy out. We looked at a whole host of scenarios to see what would that do to our rates. We were very concerned about the fact that now that the PERS board has adopted more realistic discount rate and what that was going to do to your contribution rates, how could we, as my colleagues have said before, snap that curve down a bit? And so we looked at a whole host of scenarios. It just so happened that we landed on this one as being the most reasonable approach to go forward with. One thing that we have committed to do at Finance and that we've been talking with staff and that we're planning on doing is that we will host a series of meetings, or at least one or more meetings with interested members and your staff, and we will bring you in and we will sit down with the CalPERS actuaries that we worked on with this proposal, and we will put the model up on a big screen so people can go in there and say, what happens if I get 5% return? What does that do to our numbers over the next 20-year period? We have that ability to do that. They developed the model for us, and we've committed to doing that with staff. The other thing that we've committed to doing is also we are reaching out to the Actuarial Advisory Panel, and we're going to ask them to review this proposal and report back to both the legislature and the governor on their opinions related to our proposal. So we hope to have that coming as well. There are a smaller group, so it won't be here by September 1st, where we're obviously hoping to have our report, but we do plan to have that done by the end of this calendar year, given their limited size. But those are things that we are going to do, and those are things that we have committed to doing.
That would have been helpful to share, Mr. Howard, at, I don't know, 2 o'clock? just from my perspective. Thank you for that. Anything else before I move? let me just go over here to Mr. Glazer, and I'll come back to you, Senator Stone. Mr. Glazer?
And I appreciate Finance, that clarification. And look, I wouldn't expect anything less. You guys are smart people. You're trying to do your best for the state and for financial solvency. So I get that. I think the frustration this member has, and maybe others share, is that we haven't walked through those scenarios with you. We haven't been privy to that kind of analysis and the assumptions and all the different things that go into these tough, analysis that have to take place. And all we have heard is that here's the plan. Our analyst says that we should be looking at these alternatives, and they should be examined carefully, and we don't have that in front of us. A September review doesn't seem like that's what a prudent decision maker should, do after the fact. It should be something that happens before the fact, and that's the frustration that comes out of it. Back to the analysts, one of the things the analyst hasn't talked about is the legal risk. You talked about the budgetary risk and the rest under these different scenarios, but you've raised some very serious questions about whether this is legally appropriate. Could you address those?
Certainly. So this is a new form of borrowing for the state. And because of that, we think that it's important for the legislature to have a written opinion from the Attorney General as to the constitutionality of it. The administration has had internal legal opinions, but there's something quite different between an internal legal opinion and a written opinion from the AG.
So, thank you for that. And Madam Chair, if I may follow up.
Please.
So the thing that we've gotten some clarification on a couple minutes ago is that the administration in their budget architecture has scored over $600 million based on the adoption of this plan. And that means that we are proposing to spend that money on things that presumably we all want the state to do. That if we don't adopt this plan, we are putting $600 million in spending at risk. To the analysts, have you reviewed what those scenarios are and what if we make a choice to wait and to have this review be done more thoroughly, what we're putting at risk within the budget architecture?
Well, as the Department of Finance and the Treasurer's Office noted earlier, the payments are not scheduled to go out immediately. So this isn't necessarily a decision that needs to be made right away. It is a decision, in theory, could wait until later in the legislative session. Actually, I think that hopefully answers the question.
Okay. So we face a situation now where we have, through a course of a matter of weeks, have been heard of a new plan from the administration to deal with what we know is a big problem. And yet, maybe inadvertently, we've now presumably spent $600 million that's dependent upon us adopting this plan. That locks the state into a $6 billion payment to CalPERS that we really can't fully unravel for a long, long time, based on a lot of different assumptions. That seems, I'm trying to summarize my dilemma, and maybe members share it or disagree with it.
I might. Mr. Stone, and then we'll go over here to Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Tim, thank you for your expertise in being here today. I appreciate it. You've taught me a lot already today. But when you were responding before, and you mentioned that if you were pretty stable and you came into a $10,000 inheritance, what would you do with it? I think one of the most important questions is how much risk do you want to take, right? So here we're talking about basically taking the state savings account, and my concern is that we're taking it out of a low interest bearing modality and we're putting it into the pension liability at a time when the stock market is at its highest, property values are probably at their highest. We know that our economy rubs and ebbs and flows. We're probably due, as the governor's been predicting, for a downturn. So my concern is that we send this money over and we go into a crisis. Certainly if we went into a crisis like we did in 2008, 25%, I believe, of PERS investments evaporated overnight, then our $6 billion, turns into, roughly $4.5 billion. And yet we're going to be bearing the consequences of that. So is this not risky for us to do this with the markets the way they are? And maybe you can confirm, but I believe in the last 2 years, hasn't been the rate of return in PERS been about 1 or 1.5 points? And how can we go from 1.5 points as an average over the past 2 years and just assume that we're going to have 7% over the next 20 years? To me, that seems like pie in the sky.
Senator, there is no such thing as a financial transaction in securities, whether they are equity securities or fixed income securities, that is without risk. There is no such thing. Even an investment in U.S. Treasury securities bears risk. So I don't want to walk out of here today leaving you with the impression that the treasurer and his staff believe that this is without risk. Rather, it is our view that it is an appropriate risk to the circumstances. And here's why. I want to be careful here that I don't sound impertinent when I say this, but to a simplistic fellow, the state's obligation to fund PERS consists of two parts. Its normal cost to pay for this year's employees' service and looking forward, and a part that says, by how much have we missed targets in the past? Our view is that that constitutes a debt by any other name. An unfunded liability is a debt. The debt is accruing interest at the assumed rate of return in PERS. So the question to a very simplistic financial person is, if I have money in my hand and I can invest it at less than 1% in the pool money investment account, or I can pay off a credit card that's earning 7% interest, what should I do? And at first blush, the answer feels very obvious. Well, I should pay off the credit card. But I'm not finished. If I pay off the credit card, what have I done to impact my liquidity? Because I can't predict the future. I don't know what might happen a year or 2 or 3 from now. And once the money is gone to pay off the credit card, can I borrow it again? My answer as a financial professional, and this is something that would have to be done with the administration, the treasurer, and the controller, is that some of you know I made my bones up here showing the state of California how to borrow money in the short term, okay? I believe in very conclusive terms that if there is some misalignment that occurs in the future, and I can't tell you when that would be, Senator Stone, but if it were to occur, this state, particularly now and particularly as a result of what this body has done, the voters have done, this governor has done over the past handful of years, make this state highly creditworthy, and it could borrow externally what is being proposed to lend internally and substitute an external debt for an internal debt. I will not predict what will happen at CalPERS. That's not my business. I don't try to do that. There's an old expression in my business that if you live by the crystal ball, you're bound to eat crushed glass for breakfast. So I don't do that. I'm a fixed income person. But in that very narrowing context, in response to your question, I believe this is appropriate.
Okay, and then I've heard that before we make this allocation that we're 64% funded. Is that correct at this time?
64, 65%.
Okay, so not being a financial guru, what are the ranges of that percentage where we are in the danger zone, and where do we get into the comfort zone? And to get into the comfort zone, does the administration or this legislature have any plan to get there? And if so, how?
In terms of the funded status, sir? So the goal is always to achieve 100% funded status. And currently there's a plan in place to achieve 100% funded status within 30 years. So that's how CalPERS, every year they sort of recalculate their contribution rates that are sent to us to pay. That's where our $6 billion in current funding for pensions come from. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, just responding to what you just said, that is assuming a 7% return on investment for the next 30 years.
Correct.
Right? Does that really seem realistic?
It does, over a long period of time, absolutely. The median continues to, the returns sort of revert to the median, which is 7% over a 20-year period, even higher over
Sign
a
up for
30-year
that account. Mr. Elio, would you like to respond to that? I'd like to hear your thoughts about, for 30 years, we're going to get a 7% return on investment. Is that realistic?
CalPERS, when they adopt their assumption, like any pension system, thinks very long-term horizon. And over, a multiple decade period, 7% is within the realm of possibility for the pension fund. I think that in the hearing, in the discussion today, there's mention of the 6% return that their advisors suggested they might get, but that was over the next 10 years. And so what we're talking about here is over a much longer time period, 7% is within possibility.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to buy into one of those.
Question. So there's a report due September 1, 2017. You all have been talking about the incremental nature of the borrowing and the pay down. When would the first payment be made?
Not until October 1st of 2018. I think that's when our first quarterly payment is made.
October 1st of
I'm sorry, 2017.
17. Hope Springs.
Had the wrong year.
So once this report issues, in the unlikely event that there's negativity in it, I assume that this body can revisit this, can have a conversation with the administration on the propriety of this program.
The trailer bill before you actually provides the statutory authority for the transfer of the funds. So that is a separate question than the report. Obviously, the report goes to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, but the actual statute before you does authorize the transfer of the funds.
But I suppose again, in the unlikely event that the report is negative with respect to this proposal, I certainly assume that the administration would want to have a conversation about the program, notwithstanding the fact that we're authorizing the appropriation of the money at this point.
I don't think anything precludes the legislature from convening a hearing to discuss the report and its contents.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify, one, that the money was going to be borrowed and paid after the report issued, and that of course, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee will be involved, and our chair will be involved, and if it deviates from what's been testified to today, I think you can assume that several of us are going to want to have a conversation around the table. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator McGuire, and this will be our last comment.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I appreciate all the conversation here today. Just one item, Madam Chair, and I don't know where you want to be able to move on this specific item here today, but one suggestion just thrown out would be understand that this would be going to the JLBC, but I think hearing the interest from many of the committee members, for the life of this loan, if this legislative body were to take this recommendation forward, to be able to have an annual hearing at the Senate budget hearing, budget meeting, budget committee, thank you, to be able to discuss this issue and to be able to get status updates. I think that would help me. I've heard Senator Glazier, Senator Morlock, many of you talking about that, but having an annual hearing on this issue would be, I think, beneficial to all of us to get status reports.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's fair to say, Ms. Costa, that a number of Budget Committee members, including myself, when we first heard this in Budget Committee, acknowledged that on the surface appeared to be a good idea, but there was deep concern and many questions. I am clear about what went into the core architecture of the budget. I am also clear about the fundamental role of trailer bill, which is to operationalize what went into the budget. And that also requires a level of comfort and agreement, not only from the administration, but with the legislature as well. And so I think based on today's conversation, we're going to hold this item open and use this opportunity as a really informational hearing on AB 100. Thank you very much for everyone for your questions and comments. Let's move on to, yes, sir. Let's move on to AB 104.